24%. I don't understand. Outside of my fairly minimal console gaming, right now I'm playing through this just because I found a cheap PS4 copy, I almost exclusively game under Linux. And it's always fun to go back through the Steam hardware survey just to see how the Linux numbers are actually changing. And considering the December 2022 numbers are out, it seems like a perfect time to do a recap over that year, especially considering that the SteamDeck came out and it completely changed the numbers. So, starting the year in January, Linux had a Steam market share of 1.06%, which for Linux is actually really impressive. I believe October, November, something like that, the previous year, it had finally cracked that 1% mark, and then ending the year with 1.38%, which doesn't sound that crazy, but put it into the context of how big that increase is. That is roughly a 30% increase. But keep in mind, that's not necessarily the exact market share, so it is pretty normal to see little fluctuations month to month. For example, back in November, Linux had a 1.44% market share. The reason for this is the Steam hardware survey isn't sent out to every single Steam user on every single machine they use. So sometimes more Linux users will get it, sometimes more Windows users, but this does give you a general idea of what's going on. But if you take the number over a long enough period of time, it is going to indicate a trend. And that trend is basically going up. In the early days, it was a fairly slow rise. In many cases, you could say this is pretty much flat, but ever since the Steam Deck started getting shipped, the number has been going up very, very quickly. And it's not like people want to own a Steam Deck just because it's a really neat piece of hardware that you can use as a paperweight. It is a really cool gaming device that is made possible because of how much effort Valve has put into Linux gaming. Whether it's on Proton development, on anti-cheat, funding Linux desktop and Linux kernel projects to make the Linux gaming experience actually good. I started using Linux, I don't know, a couple of years back, and even back then, Linux gaming was in a pretty good state. Not perfect, nowhere near as good as it is today. Nowadays, a lot of those games I couldn't play just work. Even games that notoriously didn't work because of anti-cheat, a lot of those games are now just running perfectly fine, no issues at all, which is kinda crazy, and is a big part of why it's going up so quickly. But how much of an effect is the Steam Deck really having? Well, let's have a look at the numbers. The Steam Deck started shipping in late February 2022. Way too late for the February Steam hardware survey. The earliest was going to be March. But due to the way that Valve actually shows their data, it wasn't in March. In the case of the Steam hardware survey, it groups a lot of the distros into other, rather than showing them as individual results. The first time the Steam Deck and SteamOS was visible on the hardware survey was in May. At that point, Linux had a market share of 1.12%, and SteamOS, which is SteamOS Hollow, had a market share of 5.23% of Linux. Now, ignore the fact the numbers here look different, and SteamOS is not listed on this page. I don't know why it's like that. And at this stage, it's well behind everything besides Linux Mint. And Linux Mint usually trades last place with Pop! OS. Not by a major margin, they're usually both around 5% or so. To be completely fair though, I hate the way that Valve shows their numbers. Right now, Arch Linux is at the top in May, but if you do a bit of thinking, you can see 2 Ubuntu LTS results, because this one had just come out. In reality, Ubuntu is actually at 20% or so, plus any older LTS releases, and depending on whether you want to count the non-LTS releases as well. But the rolling releases, because there's not different versions of them, that's counted as one complete thing. I wish Valve would just merge together the different releases of a point release, or give me the option of seeing both. Either that, or stop bundling everything into other unless you have no way to actually distinguish what it really is. If you showed a big list like is shown with Windows, it wouldn't really matter. And because the Steam Flatpak is technically versioned in the same way, it also afflicts that as well. So you sometimes see it on the list, you sometimes don't. It's kind of a mess, and I know you know how to count it because it sometimes appears on the list. Just have it always on the list. Please, it'll make everyone's lives so much nicer. But let's just ignore my whining. By August, the number had grown even higher. Linux had a market share of 1.27%, which is already crazy enough, but the SteamOS had a market share of 13.69%. It was growing very, very quickly, but it didn't stop there. By December, with that 1.38% Linux market share, SteamOS had a market share of 24.07%. What the hell? 24%. I don't understand. But because SteamOS and the Steam Deck are so high, it breaks the rest of the Linux part of the survey. The top CPU is an AMD CPU. On the overall survey, I think AMD is at like 33%. But the GPU is my favorite part. The top GPU is an AMD, not just a single AMD, a double AMD, custom GPU 0405, which I'm just assuming is probably the Steam Deck GPU. And at least in the short term, I don't see how this number could go down. Maybe in the long term if they don't update it and don't release a Steam Deck 2, but as it stands, the current Steam Deck isn't even shipping worldwide yet. It is only shipping to a tiny handful of countries. Now, a lot of those countries are fairly big. It's shipping to the European Union, but there's a lot of other places that can't get it. Plus, it's still a reservation device, so you still need to wait. When you can just go and buy a Steam Deck whenever you want, I wouldn't be surprised if this goes up to like 50% of Linux. And if that does happen, Valve might need to rethink how they actually show the Linux numbers. I really think they should get rid of this stupid other category and actually show me what is in the list. Hopefully they do that. If you hear this, Valve, or someone who works there, please just go and show me the numbers. I know you have the numbers already, just show them on the page. And that's pretty much it for the Steam Deck numbers, but there is another very interesting trend happening. That trend, wait for it, is with Manjaro. So for pretty much the longest time now, Manjaro has been a bigger distro on the Steam hardware survey than base Arch Linux. In January, Manjaro had a 12.3% market share and Arch Linux 11.75%. While these seem fairly close and you might expect them to jump back and forth every so often, Manjaro was always consistently ahead of Arch Linux. But this year, that started to change. By May, Arch Linux was at 12.85% and Manjaro now at 11.09%. It seemed like it was consistently dropping month on month. Now you might say, what about SteamOS? And yes, there is definitely a possibility that SteamOS is a big factor in this distro dropping. But let's go to December. At December, Arch Linux was at 9.16%, so it definitely did drop, and Manjaro at 6.4%. It had dropped overall considerably further, so unless there is a disproportionate number of Manjaro users that also now happen to have a Steam Deck, it seems as if Manjaro is slowly falling out of favor as a distro for gamers. But it's probably a little bit too early to make that as a conclusive statement. If it keeps going that way by this time next year, maybe we can say that is really the case. And if that does happen, I don't know what that means overall for Manjaro and its community. Does that mean that Manjaro is sort of losing favor as a gaming distro, or as a distro generally? I don't really know, but it does seem like sentiment against Manjaro is slowly starting to grow over time, and more people are at least considering a proper Arch-based distro. But maybe it's just a coincidence. In which case, let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. What do you think's happening on the Steam hardware survey? Do you think SteamOS is going to become the biggest thing by far? It's already the biggest thing, but even bigger in the Linux distro space? Or do you think this is basically the cap it's going to see? I would love to know. And if you like this video, remember to go and like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, go check out my Patreon, Scribe, Snelly, Pay, linked in the description down below. I've got a podcast called Tech Over Tea. I've got a gaming channel called Brodie Games. That's going to be it for me, and I'm out.